Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very special lecture. You will notice that unlike some of the other lectures I've done where it's just been me sitting in a room talking to you, I now have virtual colleagues online to join us in this awesome conversation where we're going to do an intro to the study of comics academically. I am going to let them introduce themselves. We can do ladies first and start with the Phoenix sisters. Go ahead and tell us all about yourselves.
Hi there, I'm Kelly Guentner. I am a cosplayer, podcaster, author of two, hopefully going to be three soon, superhero romance novels. And I've been a comics fan for most of my life. I've been a superhero fan for pretty much all of my life. And I am very enthusiastic about comics and also comics history and how it interplays with American history specifically is really my area of interest and expertise.
Her book Scorcher is also quite good. If you like superheroes at all, you should probably, hint, hint, check it out.
Thank you.
Hi, I am Crayle. I am the other Phoenix sister. Kelly and I have a cosplay duo where between the two of us, we try to get at least one character represented every month. So the superhero love runs strong with me as well. I am newer to comics. I did not start reading them until I was around 20, 21, something like that. And there's a lot to get into, but it's brought so much to my life. Ryan and I, he'll introduce himself in a moment, actually run a show that is helping people get over that overwhelm and learn where they want to start if you're getting a late start to comics. So big love of mine. I love visual storytelling. And then I'm also a fiction editor myself, just not for comic books. I edited Kelly's second book and did her second edition of Scorcher. So storytelling, I've been like an English tutor since I was 14 or 15. Storytelling is something that I've been like studying and very interested in since I was a kid. So that's me. I'm like a language nerd in addition to being a superhero nerd. So that's Crayle.
She's also a very talented visual artist and has a shop that has some really awesome stuff if you are into nerd culture.
That is so funny that you bring that up. Anyway, greetings and salutations, young scholars. My name is Ryan. I am a host and producer of the YouTube channel called Nerd Culture, where we talk about all things nerdy, movies, TV, comic books, that sort of thing. And as Crayle pointed out just a moment ago, she and I co-produce and co-host a show called Comic Books, the New Class, where we introduce new readers or even veteran readers to certain comic books or graphic novels they may or may not have heard of before. We educate them, we throw some stuff at you, maybe some titles you may want to check out somewhere down the line if you feel so inclined to be professional. And I've been a comic book fan for the last 7 years. I've been fascinated by them. I've learned some things from them, and I enjoy reading them. And heck, life is better when reading. Am I right, folks? All you got to do is take a look. It's in a book. That's why we're here. But anywho, I'm just happy to be here. So thanks for having me. This is going to be a great discussion, Professor.
Thank you. And Ryan also can boast of having interviewed more authors and comic book creators than anyone I know. So that's also a big thing for him. Cool. Well, let's jump right on into it, starting with the theoretical aspect of comics that you got from Scott McCloud's seminal Understanding Comics, which is, for people like myself, the text to read if you want to begin understanding comics as a genre. And I assigned to you all the specific chapter on the concept he calls closure, which is what I consider to be the real heart of comic books as a medium. So, that being said, thoughts?
Well, for one, I really loved when it talked about how Eastern versus Western visual storytelling is different. So I've been into anime since I was little, like watching the 90s Sailor Moon dub that was really terrible when I was a kid, right? And one of the things that McLeod brought up was that you see a lot more than just the action to action types of transitions, where you're supposed to build your own connections, and that there are fewer of those in Japanese comic books or manga, what have you. And that's clearly part of like the cultural visual storytelling in Japan and other parts of the East, because maybe you're new to comics, but you might have been watching anime for a long time if you're watching this. And you know those slice of life scenes, like, you know, a train is going by, the sun is coming up, an ant is climbing up a blade of grass on the edge of the city that you're about to see the action in now. And I sometimes feel that that's missing in especially older Western comics. So I love that he mentioned that. I love that it came up as a contrast.
I agree that it's really interesting to think about the difference between Eastern and Western, and also the difference between decades. You can tell a comic, or if you've studied comics for a while, you can tell what decade a comic is from. If you're talking like US comics, just by looking at how busy the page is and what sort of storytelling is going on the page. You can also tell what artist it's from, what era that artist is. So there's different trends. So right now there's a trend going on that people have mixed feelings about, where they'll kind of repeat a panel. They'll repeat the visuals of a panel. Sometimes they'll have, or with different dialogue, or just with silence for certain effect. And some people think it's lazy, and sometimes it is lazy. Let's be real. But sometimes it really is, like, it really sells the joke that they're trying to sell, or the moment they're trying to sell. And that's like the visual trend that's going on right now. And it's interesting to kind of watch how those trends come and go in comics. And comics is such a visual storytelling medium, but it's different from other visual storytelling mediums. Comics is not movies. You know, it's like a cousin of movies, and that's why some comics can translate to movies, but some cannot, because the storytelling is different. And it's just fascinating to think about, like, those pauses between what's the story told in the gutters, that Point made, is really an art form, and what's told off screen is fascinating. So I enjoyed that point that was made. Ryan, do you have thoughts?
Well, nothing that can compare to you fine people, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. See, this is my way of breaking the ice, students, scholars, whoever may be watching or listening to this. So the thing that stood out to me was the different ways they presented their stories, like moment to moment, second to second. Maybe there was a wider panoramic view of a certain scene that was going on, or a sequence or a panel that was being presented in a comic. You know, because there are different styles that writers and artists like to tell their stories, and that's something that fascinates me in terms of what kind. Are you going to see them react from second to second, or are you going to see characters react like one thing happens in one panel and then it takes place about a few minutes later? Oh, this person may be at someone's office, whereas in the first panel they may be driving their car on the way to work. Something like that. That is something that fascinated me. Because in filmmaking, they do these things where they do the establishing shot, then they can do either close-ups, they can do extreme close-ups, like our good friends Wayne Campbell and Garth Algar did so eloquently in Wayne's World Parts 1 and 2. Yes, there were 2 films, not just one. And you also do these wide shots where you can give an idea of where they are and the locations and the landscapes of that kind of deal. That's some of the things that fascinated me in this particular study, where people were talking about, okay, this is how I present my story, but then this is how another person may present their story. And there's nothing wrong with that. People go about presenting their stories in different ways, and that's how we learn from each other. So that's one of the things that stood out to me.
That's another one of those things that evolves over time. Also, the way Kelly was talking about is the issue of closure that the author was talking about, how your brain auto-completes. I feel that as time goes on, we're actually doing more and more and more closure in comic books, when closure, like the hard work that the reader has to do, becoming complicit in the storytelling, is the most heavy-handed with comics out of other mediums, right? And in the Superman and Batman and Spider-Man examples that are also part of this lesson, for example, there's a header saying like, meanwhile, this and this and this were happening, and those are going away. Now it's like you'll see some dialogue happening, and then the next page is a full page panel of just one action, and you have to build the whole story between this conversation to now this whole scene that's going with no writing whatsoever. Which I really wonder how that affects the relationship between artist and writer that McLeod also talks about. Like, I would love to talk to somebody behind the scenes. Maybe the next time I'm interviewing a comic book creator, I'll ask them about that.
Do you think that the reason for that is because comic tropes are so familiar that we can fill in the blanks? So we don't need to say, we don't need as much commentary to spoon feed us information. Like, the best example I can think of is from Mark Waid's Superman Birthright. He was able to boil down Superman's origin story to 4 panels with like 4 words. And it was his entire origin story, because we all knew the origin story, and it was beautiful, absolutely beautifully done. And we didn't need any more than that because everyone knows Superman's origin story. So we didn't need a big, long, drawn out origin story. And like, yeah, that's a very specific example, but a lot of the tropes we know. So like, say you're doing someone's origin story where they fall in a vat and get superpowers. You don't need to have a whole bunch of text explaining this person gets superpowers. You could just show them falling in a vat, and then the next page can be a splash page of them with their superpowers. Whereas previously in the 50s, you had to explain that because that's not a logical jump.
I think that's a big part of it for our legacy characters, but I'm noticing the trend also in independent comics. And my theory is that some of that has to do with assumptions that the storytellers are telling. So in any part of like the communications world, whether it's entertainment writing and storytelling, or even if it's like advertising and things like that, people are making constant assumptions about the way people read and absorb information. And the buzzwords for the last decade have been all about shorter attention span, instant gratification. And so I feel like maybe comic book artists are actually trying to trick us into thinking that we're doing less because we had to do less reading, when really our mind is having to construct more and more of the story and figure out what the writer is telling us without them telling us.
Yeah. And that is actually what I find to be most fascinating about the concept of closure and what's going on in the comic, is the fact that, like you said, people have assumed for a long time that comic books are somehow inferior to other forms of art, like reading, for instance, and prose fiction, or even film, because there's this conception that they're juvenile and that the medium itself is somehow stupid. But the thing is, as McLeod very eloquently demonstrates, your mind is actually much more engaged in a comic book than in a film. And in many cases, I dare say, even prose fiction, because there isn't the same kind of connect the dot thing going on. There is obviously imagination involved in prose fiction, but it's of a different kind. It's not the same dance, like he talks about, between the artist and the reader that makes it really fascinating. And one of the things I wanted to ask you guys about, one of the things that's so fascinating to me, is actually something even though I have a huge amount of respect for McLeod, I might disagree with him about. So this is his classic example of closure, right? The axe murderer, where we have panel number 1, panel number 2, and your mind fills in the blanks, right? So McLeod holds that closure is 100% voluntary, that you have to consciously decide to participate in the comic in order to make this happen. I'm not 100% convinced that this is actually the case, because my contention is, thinking about it, if you've lived long enough to realize that axe murderers tend to kill people, I'm not sure that you can actually imagine just anything happening in between those two panels.
I agree. That's such a weird take on this, and I kind of felt the same way. Just what what else would you think would happen between the two to make the guy scream? That's so strange. Like the point he made about you could imagine the crime any possible way,
Mhm,
but that's not a voluntary, like you're not choosing to imagine that.
mhm,
That comes from your own psychological baggage.
mhm. Like he talks
So
about, like,
in that way, it's
yeah,
like a Rorschach.
yeah. Well, he kind of seems to imply that, oh, I didn't kill the guy. You sickos are the one who killed him, by imagining that he died in between those panels. And I'm like, I don't know about that, Scott. I mean, to quote one of my other colleagues, oh, obviously they sat down to tea after this.
Yeah,
In between the
obviously.
panels. That's what happened, obviously.
You still choose whether or not to make an assumption, though, between these two panels. With this being all I have, I could think that scream is actually the person getting away. I could assume that the axe murderer doesn't succeed, but I'm kind of a dark person, and also I'm affected by the type of media I choose to consume over and over again. I've read a lot of zombie and post-apocalyptic stuff, so I have to choose, like, if I only have this information, did the person live or die? And in my mind, obviously he died. And so I still had to make choices about the way I filled in the picture. And to me, I do feel like that makes me a creative accomplice. Like, I don't think closure itself is voluntary. Like, that's like saying it's a choice to see while your eyes are open. Because that's something your brain does. I mean, closure actually happens to us. We blink all the time, and we assume that unless we saw something move, nothing did, or if something was on a trajectory, if we blink for a little extra time, we still fill in the trajectory of the way something was moving. I don't think closure as like a psychological effect is voluntary, but a lot of other parts about the way closure works in a storytelling format, once your gutter gets wider and wider there, the metaphorical gutter in this case, not the actual spacing, there are a lot of choices you're making. I do think it's a voluntary act to engage with the content and to choose what you assume.
This is true, because closure as a concept outside of comics, like he explained, all of us do it every day, either consciously or to some degree maybe unconsciously, where none of us know anything for sure in an objective perspective except what's literally in front of our faces at any given instant, right? So I assume that my car has not blown up in the parking lot, but I don't know that for sure, right? Because I am not currently looking at my car. So I have no certainty that it hasn't blown up, but I assume that it hasn't because I've left it in the parking lot multiple times and it's never blown up. But that's no guarantee. And there's a degree to which, by default, it seems like at least I live my life with a lot of that closure. But then once I'm aware of the closure, I can start making those choices, right? Because I could choose to not put faith in my car still existing and start to become paranoid and frantically run out to the parking lot at this instant to see if it's still there, right? But I choose not to do that. So that's interesting, Crayle, is the bottom line there.
What do you think, Ryan?
I mean, granted, I'm looking at these two panels. I'm thinking, yeah, this is every single horror film I've ever seen in my life. I mean, people get killed, people die, there's blood spatter. Sorry to get a little graphic on this program. I know this is probably not what you want to hear, but it's the truth, and the truth hurts sometimes. But horror movies, yeah, this is what I'm thinking with these two panels particularly. But outside of that, comics sometimes don't have closure. Sometimes comics have something known as a cliffhanger because you want to keep the people, you want to keep bringing the people back, right? It's just like television. It's just like a movie that sets up a sequel, which, by the way, there are too many sequels. Too many. Stop making sequels. Just make standalone movies. Because someone actually published an article the other day that says, have we lost this art of the standalone film? And I think to a degree we have, because everything's about what's going to be the next big thing, right? What's going to be the next big franchise? What's going to make the most amount of money? Let's just keep making sequels that nobody asked for, right? I mean, why? Anyway, when it comes to comics, though, that's the business of comics. They want to they want to keep bringing the people back, because if they end their story with closure, sure, it's fine, because a lot of single issue comics, also known as floppies, which is a very old school word. I know I'm dating myself. They have closure. Some of them don't. Some of them are continuing an ongoing series, because every single character that's ever been presented to you in a comic book gets rebooted, right? They get revamped by a different artist and a different writer and creative team. Am I right? So these two panels could mean one thing. They could possibly mean something else too, because sometimes horror films, sometimes they do pull off the curtain of saying misdirection. With the eyes see and the ears hear, the mind believes. So there you go.
That is so interesting the way you put that together, because this whole time I've been thinking, like, it's so funny that the word closure for connecting this to that without actually having the information that goes there is the same word as the word we need for when something gets wrapped up neatly and has an ending that makes sense. Because we have to, in a comic book, you have to create your own closure sometimes. Yep. If they go with a more minimalistic palette and stuff, whereas like in a movie or something like that, what you see is what happened, and they want like that's a medium that wants you to assume that what you saw is what happened unless you were being tricked. Whereas like if it was a direct mislead, whereas in comic books, artists have a lot more leeway to intentionally tell a story in a way that makes that Rorschach effect that Kelly was mentioning earlier get more and more pronounced based on how far apart they move what happens in one panel to another. The non sequitur type transitions even that McLeod talked about that are uncommon, but I feel like they still make a lot more sense in a comic book than a non sequitur would in a movie. If a movie suddenly pulled the camera all the way back to an ant climbing up a piece of grass, I would be like, was this supposed to be in here? Whereas in a comic book, I really feel like I can assume that there's some thematic importance to that ant on the blade of grass, because the storytelling works in this way that you make assumptions from panel to panel to fill in the gaps.
Agreed, Kelly. I'm sorry, Crayle. You two are the
It
same
happens
person, so
all the time.
I know. I also, you guys are bringing up something I also wanted to talk about, which is how the amount of panels and the amount of closure that's being demanded, or even the kind of closure that's being demanded, can actually alter the story that's being told. So I wanted to ask you guys about this whole section he did. What did you think about this, where he has this one page telling the story with a lot of small panels, and then he keeps narrowing it down until he gets to 4 panels, and the effect that had on the story he was telling?
Well, for me, sorry, ladies, don't mean to jump in. I'm trying to be a gentleman here, but with this,
Go for it.
with this, I'll jump right in. See, I'm allowed one lifeline here on this game show once in a while. So here's what I'm going to say to this. And I've learned this as I've gone throughout the course of my reading comic books and reading some of the things that came before, some of the things that are in modern day, some of the things that have come out recently. Less is always more. Less is always more. And I've learned this not just with comic books, because comic books is an art form, but with people I've met at conventions. I've talked to them, and people who put these things together. Fan art, I know, is one of the terms, but less is more. You get so much more from not having as much on a canvas. And I think when it comes to comic books, our brains can fill in the blanks pretty darn quick. If you give us 4 or 5, maybe 3 or 4 on a page, like one, like on the left-hand side of a page and the right-hand side of it. Like, for example, for argument's sake, right? You have 2 or 3 panels on the left side of this page, and then you have 4 or 5 on the other. That's fine, but for the most part, if you just put 3 and 3 or 2 and 2, my brain can connect the dots because for the most part, we as human beings, we can piece things together. We can't probably put together that ugly little thing known as a Rubik's Cube very well. I can't do it. That's too much, folks. It's too much. It's too much stress.
Forget the Rubik's Cube. Whoever invented that?
Well, they made a good amount of coin off of it. Not that I'm saying it should have been for profit, but hey, that's what people do when they design things. It's for profit most of the time. Not always, but anyway, to get off the beaten path here. When it comes to panels, less is more, and I've learned this more with the modern day issues of comics, is that they're starting to realize, hey, audiences are getting it because the movies are out there, the TV shows have been out for decades and decades and decades. They get it. They get it. If you put 2 panels on one page and 2 panels on the other, they're going to be able to connect the dots because they've seen enough forms of media respectively that they can piece it together. If that makes any lick of sense to my colleagues here on this wonderful panel.
It made sense to me. I agree completely. This was my favorite. Go ahead, Kelly.
No, you go.
Okay. This was my favorite part out of the selected readings from this, like, I'm getting excited and it's making me mix my words all up. So I'm an editor, right? And what information you leave in versus what information you take out, even if we can assume what happened in there, we can assume that almost all of this happened with just the 4 panels. But what you do and don't leave in changes the emphasis. So, for example, if you take out the part of he goes to pick up that girl that he wants to hang out with, but she's actually not available and postpones until the next day. Well, if she's a big character in this franchise, then you would want to leave that in, even though it doesn't change the effect of he drank and drove and that's why he died, because that character is going to be affected by, if I had just gone out with him, he wouldn't have been alone. Maybe he wouldn't have drank. Maybe I could have stopped him. But if she's never shows up again, did you really need that in there? The effect is the same, right? And so what you do and don't leave in there, even though a lot of this isn't necessary, can change the tone and the connotations of the result, which is dead guy, right? And the effects that go around it. So if you liked this part of the reading, I really think you should go home and play around with like something erasable, like a pencil or something, and exit out certain sections out of the longest piece that you get and see how that changes the story. Because I'm an editor, right? So I'm constantly like, you don't need this, or you need to expand more on that, right? And this, I'm going to do this again, even though I've already done it a couple of times for myself, and just be like, look, how does it change if you leave out or leave in this information? Even the parts that seem really repetitive, like opening the car door, getting in the car, closing the car door, starting the car. Like, if this were a horror novel, I might leave that in just to build suspense. But if this is a comedy, that's just wasting time until I get to my next joke, right? So I really think you should print this out, go home with a pencil, cross some stuff out, and see how it changes the story for you. Sorry to give you homework when I'm not even your teacher, but it's a really useful tool for that. So if you're looking to going into editing or screenwriting or something like that, this is the stuff you want to read.
That's a great idea, Crayle.
This is why Crayle is an amazing editor. She's really good at knowing what to take out, what to leave in, what to expand. She's so good.
Thanks.
Yeah, I thought the very first version of the story was boring because it had too much. My eyes were glazing over. It literally had too much in it. I'm like, okay, there was not enough to make me care about anything. And then it was interesting to see how the story changed as you took certain parts out. how that, like Crayle said, how the emphasis of the story changed, how the feel of the story changed. At the end of, it was still the same story. It still had the same beginning and ending, but it's super fascinating. I'm with Crayle, like as a writer, I'm also fascinated by how things are altered based on what you leave in, what you don't leave in. Sometimes less is more, sometimes you don't want to take out too much though.
Indeed. See, I'm interested that you say the first one was boring, Kelly, because this is kind of like that Rorschach test Crayle was talking about. My
Yeah.
take on this one is I actually care about Carl as a character in this because even against my will, I've spent so much time with him. I've gotten to see his girlfriend and his mom, and he's been in the video store, and that brings back nostalgia and all that stuff. And I'm actually sad when he's dead at the end. And
Aw.
that's my takeaway in that one. This one I find is not that. Like, Carl is not really a character anymore. At least not in the same way he is in that first one, where I haven't gotten to know him as much. And it also makes him look stupider, if that's possible, to me, because we don't see the whole inner dialogue about him going to the movie store first, talking to the guy before he got the beers, and then he dug one. It's by going from what'll I do now to I'll buy some beers. It gets you from, it makes you feel like he just went from one to the other really fast, and then he died. So I find Carl to be much less of a sympathetic character in this one. And then this one I just think is hilarious.
I know.
I'm so glad it's not just me, because I also found the really short one to be really funny. I imagined it down to only 2 panels at a certain point where it was just his mom saying, "Don't drink and drive," and he says, "I won't," and then just his tombstone.
All right, exactly. And in your brain, you know exactly why he died with those 2 panels. And so I find that very fascinating that even like the panels even affect something like character for me, like how much I actually care about this character. And to the point where it even becomes just, he's just a joke in that last one.
I mean, that's valid. That shows that, yeah, you have to give people enough information about the character to make them care.
Unless you don't want them to care, which is another interesting thing there, right? Because in their own way, if his goal in this comic is to make people not drink and drive, right? Each one almost seems like he's going about it in different ways. Like, for me anyway, he achieved that goal in this comic by making me care about Carl and being sad that he's dead. This one making me think, oh, Carl is kind of a loser who is obviously already an alcoholic, and that's his problem. This is a downfall of hubris type thing. He went for the beer and then he died. And then this one is like, oh, don't be a stupid idiot like that Carl guy. Yeah, what a loser.
Yeah, it really is interesting how this is just a masterclass in editing, and the fact that the gutters are important, but you cannot expect them to do all the heavy lifting.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
It's an art form.
Indeed. Which is what a lot of people have not recognized comics as for much of its history. Which is...
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Which is part of why I think McLeod's book is so important, is because he's really showing you from a more academic standpoint why comics are very intelligent, thought out forms of storytelling. I'll give one last chance for anyone to throw out anything about McLeod before we move on. Okay, you guys turned down that opportunity. So let's talk about the superhero comics, starting with debatably the first true superhero, which is an ongoing debate in academia and fandoms, I'm sure. But debatably the first superhero, Superman. and Action Comics #1, a comic book that forever changed the world, especially from a pop culture standpoint. One of the things I like about teaching Golden Age comics, the first appearances particularly of these characters, is how different they were at the beginning than how they are now. And if you are at all familiar with Superman, I can almost guarantee you that you're going to notice some differences right off the bat. But what do you guys think about this very first Superman comic?
I love it. This is exactly sorry. Okay. But let me take a breath before I trip over my words. I have a lot of feelings about Superman. So without getting too nerdy, um Superman's creators sold the rights to Superman for not very much, and then Superman got watered down to be more corporate, especially after the seduction of the innocent happened, which, probably regardless of who had the rights, probably would have happened anyways. But so Joe and Jerry, really, they were two Jewish kids growing up in the 40s or growing up in the 30s, and they envisioned this, I'm going to say it, social justice warrior. Superman started out punching corrupt politicians, punching white beaters, and just he was really against corruption. He also his superpowers were a little more down to earth than they are now. They weren't quite the powers of a god. Yeah. And they were just, oh gosh, he was such a great hero. And also he was a reporter, which is a little bit more of a respected field back then, and he was fighting for truth and justice and the American way, which it didn't quite have the baggage it has now, but and he just has turned into something different. I still love Superman in every incarnation, but Superman back then was revolutionary. Lois Lane was revolutionary. She was an intrepid girl reporter at a time when a lot of women did not work. This was before World War II, before women really entered the workforce. And Lois Lane was a career woman. She had moxie. Just this whole book is really forward thinking. And the fact that it came from teenagers is incredible. And again, it came from Jewish kids who were part of basically a minority group in the US, and you can kind of see that viewpoint because they created this character who was fighting for the little guy, and that's so important. And that's kind of what I'd like to see from Superman as he's represented in media now, and we don't get to see that as much, unfortunately. So yeah, sorry, I have a lot of feelings about Superman and the original version of Superman and the creators, and I will not get into their entire story, but there's a lot of interesting things about their backstory.
Don't apologize, Kelly. This is why I have you on this lecture.
True. I could talk for hours just about Joe and Jerry and Superman, though, so I'll spare you.
What shocked me the most wasn't how different it was. It was one thing that was the same that I was not expecting to be the same. Knowing that this came out in 1938, I assumed that Lois Lane was probably like a non-entity. And instead, like, she got to act the way Clark Kent would have wanted to act if he had not turned Clark Kent into the disguise for Superman, right? Like, she spoke her mind immediately. She didn't put up with being harassed. Like, she was vocal about what she wanted. She didn't want to be around Clark Kent. She's been avoiding him, and now she tells him she has good reason, that he's a coward. Like, just like absolutely takes a stand for herself. And, you know, in a similar time period, even to, oh gosh, I don't remember which one had the most ads in it, but it was one of the other ones. It was either the Spider-Man or Batman one that had the ads where it was so clearly aimed, every single one of them, at men from like a very stereotypical sense. Like, even if you can't draw
Spider-Man.
a single line, come draw this scantily clad woman, and just somehow that's going to fix it. We've got a way to make you an artist right away. And also, by the way, the next ad is to get ripped. Okay, like,
Oh,
all
Spider-Man.
similar. That was the Spider-Man, right?
60s.
But similar enough where it's like you go far enough back in time and you just assume that the way women are portrayed is going to be really mouse-like, and that they're not going to have a lot of agency. And 1938, Lois Lane was already super strong and outspoken. Like, and to think for a long time, sometimes some people would argue, even still now, that like women are still fighting to be on screen or on the page at all. It's one of those things that makes me think about how there have always been people trying to do the right thing and trying to include everyone and trying to like represent everybody. It's kind of like how, not to get like too off topic, hot buttony, but some people are like, oh, the founding fathers, they're all just a bunch of slave owners. Why would we listen to them? And then something really popular in media comes out, like Hamilton, that reminds you in your face over and over again, abolitionism was part of the American debate, and it was very important to a lot of people who took a lot of risks to fight slavery before the United States were even a country. And some of those people were some of our founding fathers, like Alexander Hamilton. So reading this made me confront that like back of my mind assumption that, oh, everybody just accepted that women didn't get to talk a lot in the 30s. And clearly not everybody did, because Lois Lane in this became wildly popular comic was like, you're a jerk and you can't have me, and you're a coward because you didn't do anything immediately. Like, she had so much space in the panels. Just even the amount of time that she was on the page was really shocking to me. I feel like I'm talking a lot.
That's good, Crayle. These are all things I wanted to bring out, and I'll have my own comments on it in a second. But first, I do want to give Ryan a chance to talk, as he is much more of a Superman fan than I am.
You know, considering the Phoenix sisters can talk about this all night long, if not all day long, depending on when you're watching this. See, let's talk about this for a second. Okay? So, Superman is the GOAT. He is the greatest of all time. He always has been. He always will be. In the words of Bret the Hitman Hart, which is a former pro athlete, he once said that he was the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Superman, if it weren't for that character and Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster creating this character and the legacy it has left us, this character has turned 85 years young this year, ladies and gentlemen. In the most criminally underrated comic movie in the history of cinema, known as Man of Steel, yes, that Man of Steel, Henry Cavill, you're the man, just turned a very healthy-looking 10 years young earlier this month in June of 2023. This character has a incredible history, no matter what. So as far as going back and reading the first issue way back when, from 1938 respectively, things in comic books back then were very wordy. Very wordy. A lot of speech bubbles, a lot of blurbs, a lot of words, expressions being made. I did appreciate the fact that Superman was beating up wife beaters, because no one should be treated that way. So, way to go, Super Loop. You're the man. Always has been, always will be, as my prop here likes to say. No, he doesn't say much. He's more so just quiet. But he's cool, though. He's a cool piece of my collection. So I've been a Superman fan for a very long time. And reading this book, this first issue, 1930, I realized, wow, his S-Shield is extremely different. His suit is extremely different. But at the same time, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster had this idea of, they were partially inspired by the strong man in a circus. So They wanted someone who was strong, who was courageous and brave and willing to go out there and do what they thought was right. Deliver justice in their own way. But still, as Superman likes to say in some of his iterations of the comic books, I fight for truth, justice in the American way. So there's that to consider. But this was an interesting comic to read going way back when, because imagine if we had this lovely little thing called a DeLorean time machine where Kelly, Crayle, Hollis, and myself can go 88 miles per hour and see some serious stuff. See, I replaced the word with another. And we were able to see how this comic came about. There is an argument to be made here that if it weren't for Action Comics, I believe it was Action Comics #1, if I'm not mistaken. If it weren't for Action Comics #1, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. Because that book and the heroes that followed him after Superman was created, I mean, hey, we're going to get to this a little bit later on, but when a certain little Dark Knight came about, when a certain little web slinger was spinning his webs around New York City of all places, people were starting to talk. And people were starting to realize that, hey, you can tell this is a different form of storytelling than what we're just used to reading in a newspaper every day, right? There's not just these black and white comic strips. You can put something in color, and make it magical and make it meaningful. Hence the reason that he's the greatest of all time. So, Your Honor, in conclusion, this book is very, very important. If you've never read it before, please do yourself a favor. As our good friend Biff Tannen once said, you know your history. It's very good. Learn your history. Learn your history. Read this book. Discover for yourself how different things were in the 1930s. How difficult things were for people to get things published. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's journey to get this thing made, it took time. It took time. They had to fight for it in certain cases, and once the comic came out and people were starting to read it, it caught people's imagination. It made them escape from the dangers and the struggles that they went through in the late 30s and the 40s and the 50s, because World War II, perfect example. That was a tumultuous time for many people around the globe. And Superman was that symbol of, what was it that our good friend Jor-El told his son? The symbol of Hasvel means hope. So he was a symbol of hope, still is to this day. And to be quite honest with you, there's a list out there called the top most popular symbols. Superman's S shield is in the top 3. Need I say more, Your Honor? The defense rests.
Oh, I'm very glad that I invited Ryan to be able to get that Superman spiel. That was awesome. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to bounce off a lot of what you guys said because that's what I wanted to talk about with that issue anyway. What's really interesting about the creators that comes out, I think, when you read this first version of Superman is, like you were saying, Kelly, they were Jewish. And there's a really good academic article, if you're interested, called The Jewishness of Superman, which you can read if you want to. It's a very interesting dive into that. But it's obvious. Jewish folks, sadly, have had a long history of being the underdog in a number of social, cultural, and military conflicts. And they also have a long history of stories about heroes who come out of this underdog position and wound up being on top, sometimes with supernatural powers. You can see that with the Hebrew Bible, especially Moses is a great example, Samson, also probably a little bit more relevant for Superman. Those things are there. And they were also, very interestingly, fairly hardcore socialists, as there was a huge socialist Jewish group that existed at that time. And there are, interestingly, they don't play their hand that much. They're not trying to preach their political views to people, but there are subtle things throughout it where you can see that kind of peeking through. One really interesting one to me is actually the first version of the Origin that we have, which is only a couple panels long. You'll notice, for those of you who've watched other Superman media, there's no Ma and Pa Kent, right? The only people you see around are medical professionals, and then when it's talking about him being raised, as in his background, you see him in group settings. This is fairly representative of the socialist concern with the community over and above the nuclear family. Superman, perhaps part of why he's such a good super social justice warrior, like you were talking about, Kelly, is because he's raised by an entire community, and specifically a working class community, right? With like the steel workers here. And that's very interesting that plays into their politics, playing into the scope of the story overall. Another interesting thing is the gender stuff, like you guys were talking about. Superman's personality, I find very different than what he is currently. And he's much more sarcastic, like here, than I usually find him to be in other media. And he's much more aggressive, like even with the good guys, right? He is not a man to be trifled with. He's a tough guy in the sense of what it was in the 30s. He is an embodiment of their kind of ideal masculinity, this man of action who has few words except sarcasm, and his emotions are basically smug and angry. Those two. As it goes through, he embodies that kind of ideal masculinity. And yet, Clark Kent is the opposite of that. Clark Kent is an absolute loser in terms of how their culture viewed it, because he is not a stand-up guy. He is overly polite to everyone, right? And as we see with Lois, he is a weak coward.
Though you do see Superman being softer with Lois when he tells her she doesn't need to be afraid, which is interesting.
You do, but then you also have that line, right, where he's, I advise you not to print this little episode.
That's true.
Which, after all he just did, right, sounds vaguely threatening.
That's true.
That's another one of the things that shocked me, how much had stayed the same instead of how much was different, though. So you just said, like, Clark Kent is the opposite of Superman. And the thing that's interesting about Superman as a superhero is that Clark Kent is the disguise, not Superman. And that's obvious from the very first one, because the speech bubble that's like bifurcated, like part of it is dotted with his thoughts when Lois is standing up to the guys who were harassing her. His thoughts in his head are, "You go, Lois," or something like that, while what Clark Kent is saying is, "Lois, no." Like, Clark Kent is the disguise. That's been the case from the very, very beginning. And I didn't know that was like from the very beginning. I didn't know how old that concept was, how intrinsic it was to the character.
You know, one of the things. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Ryan.
No.
All right. We're having too much fun. We're jumping over each other's thoughts. You gotta waste everyone's time. Anyway, so as far as the storytelling goes with this, and this is something that I've learned with filmmaking, with the Superman iterations that they've had in film, especially in the greatest, most underrated comic movie of all time, # those are the facts, Man of Steel. They don't give you the origin story. It goes right into him being in his mid-30s. You know, you see a ship land in Smallville, and that's immediately it transitions to him being on a fishing vessel, you know, working for a fishing crew, right? Which is brilliant, because this character's been around for so long. People know his origins. People get where he comes from. They know he has super strength and all this other incredible gifts, I might add. I'm kind of envious of you, Clark. Anyway, I wish I had some of that stuff. But needless to say, things have changed in comic books. Things have changed in film, because artists are realizing that people know these characters because they've been around for so long, right? You look at this, and this is a bit of a origin story within itself, but you see, you know, Clark Kent's the disguise, and this is something I'm maybe not so much hoping, but I'm curious to see how the character of Clark Kent is going to be presented in comic books and movies moving forward, because him wearing a pair of glasses is not the best disguise. Let's be perfectly honest. As much as I love Superman, I'm going to love Superman to the day I die, but your disguise is a product of its time. With all due respect here, Professor Hollis, It really is. They need to update his disguise or make him just not have a disguise at all, because I feel like they kind of hinted at this in Man of Steel, where pretty much everyone in Smallville knew who Clark was, but they didn't say anything because they were keeping his secret. They were being respectful. And in Man of Steel, I feel like most of the humans in Metropolis know who he is by the end of the movie, because Lois yells out, "Clark, I know how to stop them," and she got dropped off by a cop. It's like, do you not know he's trying to have a secret identity here, Lois? Do you not get it? So I feel like in modern times, in the year of our Lord 2023, there really shouldn't be a disguise. Or if there is, please update it. For the love of Pete, I would love to see someone take a, what do you call it, a stab, not to get horror movie graphic on you here, but take a stab at a new disguise for this character, okay? Because you can honestly pull an Ethan Hunt Mission Impossible stunt here, where Clark Kent wears a mask that's so good, it makes him look like a completely different person. And then when he becomes Superman, he rips the Clark Kent mask off like Ethan Hunt does brilliantly, I might add, in the Mission Impossible movies, and he becomes a different person. You see what I mean? I think that's a good way to transition the character into modern times, because glasses just don't cut it anymore. Although I will say, the way the character is presented at the end of Man of Steel, by the way, this is a spoiler for a 10-year-old movie, I'm sorry, but Henry Cavill's character of Clark Kent walks into the Daily Planet with a suit on, a regular, everyday, mild-mannered reporter suit. Remember this, Kelly? And he has the glasses on, and then Lois just pretends she'd never met him before. "Hi, my name's Lois Lane. I'm Clark Kent. Welcome to," and then she says, "Welcome to the planet. It's good to be here, Lois." And then he just winks and smiles at the camera, and I'm like, ooh, you're paying homage to the comics. I love it. But at the same time, let's update the disguise. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to defend the glasses.
Why?
It's not
Why are you gonna
just the
defend this?
It's not just the glasses. He acts different. He's holds
bumbling.
himself different. He holds himself different.
Mhm.
He wears clothing that is ill-fitting, so you can't see his frame. Also, nobody thinks that Superman has a secret identity because Superman doesn't wear a mask.
Fair points. Fair points. One of the things sorry.
Oh, I just I wanted to bring up how Ryan talking about like Smallville and eventually maybe even all of Metropolis just keeping his secret for him is a way for that tradition of more like communal raising and maybe even like socialist overtones to continue, where the community is part of what makes Superman Superman. If he needs to be safe by the community pretending they don't know something that they do know, then that's still that sense of community. But also one of the things that's interesting to me, the development, because Ma and Pa Kent later become like a really big part of why Superman is who he is and where his moral compass comes from. That later gets used for all kinds of interesting nature versus nurture arguments about, is it because he's so powerful or is it just the way he was raised? Would he try to be like an everyday hero if he didn't have superpowers? What's interesting to me between those two very different starting points for Clark Kent becoming Superman is that the goal, like the end result, ends up kind of being the same. And it makes me think about how, so we tell stories because we want to explore aspects of life where we get to control the variables, right? And so you learn a lot about what writers and then groups of people who get attracted to a certain story or character or franchise about what they want and the way they think the world is versus how it should be, based on what the end goal, what the ideal ending is. And you can tell kind of usually what the authors think an ideal ending is, even if they don't get there and it's a tragedy in the end. And it just makes me think about how people a lot of times have very, very different methods when they want the same goal. It comes up in like gun control arguments all the time, where like some people are like, people should have guns to defend themselves. And other people are like, people should try to remove guns entirely so that people don't get hurt because you're more likely to get hurt by the guns being there. And they're it's a really, really heated argument that people attach like very strong values to. But even those two diametrically opposed groups have the same goal, which is we want to be safe and we want other people to be safe. So for Superman, for some people to really attach very strongly to having two parents in like a stable home, or you have like a loving example where two people are very key in shaping you, and you grow up to be like one of the most moral superheroes, like shining paragon of what it means to be like part of making sure that the world is a more just and honest and good place, versus being raised in an entirely group setting by like doctors, scientists, people on some sort of work site, things like that, and still wanting to be a paragon of morally good behavior and making the world a more just and right place. It's just, I feel like it's one of those examples where people who seem very different from each other because of what methodology they think is most effective, a lot of times can still have the same wishes for like what an ideal world looks like and what is good.
That was very deep and philosophical, Crayle. Cool. I am going to pivot from that, though. Again,
That's why.
just for a long form podcast, we could talk for hours about that. But I'm going to go back to something you said earlier about the duality of Superman, and frankly, all superheroes in general. You set up, Crayle, the basic duality of usually one of the personalities is the real person, and the other one is the disguise. This is, I think, also very evident with Batman, for instance, where the Batman persona is who he really is, and Bruce Wayne was the disguise. With some superheroes, though, it's sometimes harder to parse that out than one might think. And I actually think that Superman is an interesting example, even in this first comic. Because on the one hand, it's very easy to say that, well, Superman is who he actually is, and Clark Kent is the disguise. At the same time, one thing that really throws a wrench into that is that Superman doesn't show any interest in Lois. And yet we know that that is not real. We know that he is actually interested in Lois romantically, but he doesn't display that as Superman, but he does display that as Clark Kent. And so which one is real becomes an interesting question, which also plays into the gender stuff, because Superman is such an embodiment of the ideal American tough guy at this time. You start to wonder, especially from an immigrant context, which the Jewish creators would have known very well, is this really his personality, or has he really studied what the culture around him values and crafted a persona that exactly fits those expectations?
I just talked so much. I feel weird answering the question first, but here it is. I think there's a bigger context than just what's. So I don't think Clark Kent and Superman are just like split completely, even in this. The point of having a secret identity is to keep people around you safe. And I feel like that's the most true ever with Superman, because he's indestructible. I mean, not, you can talk about kryptonite and stuff like that, but for the most part, he's an indestructible man. His weakest points are the people he cares about. And so it wouldn't make sense for him, regardless of how he's feeling, which what he thinks in his head and how he feels are, I would argue, the real him. Like, to a certain extent, Clark Kent and Superman, anything anybody sees from the outside is a mask. There are arguments in psychology that that's all we can ever actually show the world, and the only part of you that's real is what you think. And it wouldn't be safe for him to express too much interest in any one person as this superhuman person that the news wants to know more about and bad guys are going to be mad about. So if it's safe for Clark Kent to show interest in Lois Lane, but not safe for Superman to do it, then you have to ask yourself, do the feelings not being expressed make the feelings not real? I think both Superman and Clark Kent are into Lois Lane. I think it's both of them, and only one of them is safe to express it. So I think the duality is still intact there. I still think it's more fair to say that Clark Kent is the disguise and Superman is real, because Superman gets to act on more of his values than Clark Kent gets to. But it's not like a straight split bifurcation, because the purpose of the split personas in the first place is keeping people safe. And so there's still contextual differences that come up as to when he gets to express himself on which feelings and thoughts.
Agreed. And it's so interesting that from the very first comic, there's already so much of that really complexity already there.
So if we think about the creators were teenage boys, and Lois was the model for Lois, ended up marrying one of the creators. And they both had a thing for her. And so Clark Kent really, I'm going to get very psychological right now. Clark Kent really represents pretty much how every teenage boy feels, where they really like a girl and they want to be the suave, cool, detached guy that she's like just in awe of, that, you know, can be cool and play hard to get and whatever. But they're really the Clark Kent who's like falling all over themselves, maybe getting rejected. So when you look at it through that lens, because the creators did pour a lot of themselves into, Joe and Jerry did pour a lot of themselves into Superman and Clark Kent, for sure. Then it gets a little more, a little harder to determine whether Clark Kent or Superman are the real person. And I think, I mean, maybe it's not fair to talk about as the character evolves. As the character evolves, Clark Kent is also the real person, and and Superman, like the real person is kind of somewhere in between. Superman, to some extent, is the real person, but is also a persona that he puts on, that is this super strong hero that he projects, that is a symbol of hope. Whereas Clark Kent is Clark Kent minus, is his true persona minus the superpowers. And, you know, he puts on the bumbling reporter act to throw people off. But as Clark Kent evolves as a character, he also has a lot of heart and shows more bravery in later stories, where he's still fighting for truth and justice as a reporter. So that gets interesting. But even in this first story, Clark Kent is pursuing Lois. He's still pursuing stories at the Daily Planet and the early Superman stories, and still kind of in search of truth as a reporter, and still wanting to, shine a light on the truth, which is another way to fight for what's right. So I think it's a little more complicated than just Superman being the real person. And I think what you said about Superman kind of being a mask he puts on of what he thinks he needs to be, like, yes, Superman is to some extent his true self, but to some extent it's put on because it's what he needs to be the superhero and to fight for what he needs to fight for.
Yeah, that's like a lot what I mean, but way more well thought out about which parts of him go into which mask, being super contextual, because The Clark Kent persona, it's not as important for the Clark Kent persona to do what a community expects. It's a lot more narrow. It's what does my boss expect? What just makes me kind of not look like Superman? Whereas there are way more expectations put on Superman. So yeah, different needs, different contexts. I still feel the generality is very strongly that Clark Kent is the disguise. Because I think that probably just involves the most acting for him.
Yes.
Any other final thoughts about Action Comics before we move on to the next one?
I will reserve those. I do want to point out, I love that you were talking about the role of Jewish, the creators being Jewish, because comics are or superhero comics are an American art form. That's where they really got their start. And they're pretty much a Jewish art form in their early incarnations. Many of the creators of the first superheroes and the superheroes that loom largest were Jewish. And part of the reason is because comics, especially superhero comics, were looked down upon. And so it was a job that Jewish people found it easier to get their foot in the door because family members hiring family members was a thing. Friends hiring friends, like hiring within the community was a thing, right? Like that's how Stan Lee got his job. Which obviously we're not going to say that nepotism was a bad thing in the case of Stan Lee, okay? I'm not saying that at all, but it's very interesting that this was an art form that was very, very Jewish. And if you look at basically Jewish community beliefs, you can see them in the stories told about superheroes, and you can see a lot about the way Jewish people were oppressed and how that comes out in the superhero myths and why the superhero myths evolve the way they do. And it's very interesting because it does tell the story of Jewish people in America, I think. And that is fascinating to me. It just is. And I think it's really interesting and important to recognize that.
Agreed. Couldn't have said it better myself, Kelly. Cool. Okay, let's move on to the superhero that's more of my thing, Batman. In Detective Comics number 27, The Case of the Chemical Syndicate. Very, very different, in my opinion, than the Batman we have currently in a number of interesting ways. One thing is that you see him from the outside mostly in this comic. You do not get any interior life of Batman. You don't even realize that he's Bruce Wayne until the very end of the comic, where it's supposed to be a shocking reveal. And we also have the rather infamous, I think, panel, if you're a current Batman fan and have been familiar with Batman's whole no-kill policy, where he punches the bad guy who then falls into the acid, and then he says, a fitting in for his kind. This is quite different from the Batman that most of us know today.
YouTube marked that second as this is the most commonly replayed when I hovered over it.
Oh, really? Is that what it said? Jeez.
Something like, I don't have the wording exact, but yeah.
Because someone wrote in the comments of this book for this one here discussing the character of Batman. Imagine this being like a huge shocker that Bruce Wayne was Batman. What a twist that would have been if they didn't reveal it in the first issue. I'm like, maybe from a marketing standpoint, maybe not. Depends on how you look at it, because like I said, comics were very different in the 30s and extremely different in the 30s and 40s. I mean, I've seen your color schemes, boys. Very different. Speech bubbles everywhere. less is more, guys. Less is more, for Pete's sake. But listen, you didn't learn that until, I don't know, maybe the 80s or the 90s, maybe 2000s. But hey, we got there. It took you a hot minute. See, I'm looking at my watch, but you got there. As far as Batman goes, man, everyone keeps saying that Superman doesn't kill. Batman doesn't kill, because there's one rule that all heroes have: never kill thy enemies. Well, guess what? Christopher Reeve killed the folks from the Phantom Zone in Superman 2. He breaks Zod's hand, throws him into the deep end of the pool of his Fortress of Solitude. You know what I mean? Non falls to his death. Lois kills Ursa by punching her into the little hole there. See what I did there, Kelly? You got Batman has killed people for all kinds of decades. He did it in Tim Burton's movie. He did it in Batman Returns. He did it in didn't he do it in Batman Forever? No, Batman Forever, the guys killed himself. But anyway, I digress. The point is, heroes are not perfect. Heroes are never perfect. One of the beauties of Superman is he's more human than you think, folks. He's not just some alien from another planet. He's more human than you think. See? And Batman has a messed up life, a messed up childhood, but he used that anger that he had to right the wrongs of people in Gotham, saying, hey, I don't want kids to be orphaned like I was. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. I believe he says that. I don't know if it's in this book here, Hollis, but he says it in one comic book where he says, I promise from here on out, no kid is going to become an orphan like me. I'm going to make sure that the criminals of Gotham know that they are not going to get away with this. You know what I mean? I can't do it as well as my good friend Michael Keaton, but when you're grabbing a guy and holding him off a building and he's begging you not to drop him, and he just gives you a simple warning, I want you to tell all your friends about me. What are you? I'm Batman. I mean, that is one of the greatest lines you can ever have in a piece of media. But anyway, for issue number 1 of Batman, he had purple gloves, guys. He had purple gloves like he was a surgeon or something. That's weird. That doesn't work for me. But then again, things were different in the 40s, right? He didn't even have a Batmobile. He didn't even have a car. He didn't. He just flew in from out of no man's land, right? I think he used one of his batarangs, So this was a fascinating origin story. And also, he was very subdued in this. Like, Bruce Wayne's just chilling in this comic book. He's just like, Commissioner, has anything happened lately? Has anything gone on that you might want to share with me here, sir? And he's like,
little pipe, right?
Yeah, with this little pipe and stuff. Like, he's just chilling. Like, this whole issue, this whole origin story is Bruce Wayne being very subdued, very calm, very chill, mild-mannered, if you will. Like his DC brother known as Super Loop, also known as Clark Kent. So this was interesting to me. And then when he does dump the guy into the acid, maybe it was the same guy who becomes the Joker. I mean, he did say in the first movie, you idiot, you made me, remember? You dropped me into that vat of chemicals. That wasn't easy to get over. And don't think that I didn't try. I know you did. So there's lots to go on here when it comes to issue number 1 of Batman. Am I right, Phoenix Sisters?
Yes, I actually really, that's something that's always a relief for me going back to older comics. Sometimes I struggle because the pages are busier and there's more telling and less showing and stuff. And since I started later, that's a little jarring to me to try to go back to, but something that is a relief to me. Like, I absolutely believe that heroes today are not all Mary Sue, Marty Stews perfect all the time, but the trend in recent decades, maybe even one decade, the timeline's not super clear in my mind right now, but the trend that's like superheroes don't kill, they don't kill. That's a fantasy too far removed for me, even in the world of capes and being bulletproof and stuff, because it's like, I'll be watching, this bugged me so much. I would be watching the show Arrow, which it was a whole big thing, like, don't kill, I'm trying to atone, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you can't just run around shooting people with arrows and just assume they didn't die. You can't assume.
I hated that.
Like, sepsis is one of the most common, like, could have treated it, but it didn't get treated in time, deaths in the United States. And like 1 in every 7 or something like that puncture wound gets sepsis. It's just, to me, that's actually kind of a nitpicky thing to be like, well, actually, heroes don't kill. Like, I would so much rather see heroes know that there is a time to kill and have to struggle with when was it worth it and when was it not. I like that when I go back to older comics, and it was kind of like opening the window and a fresh breeze coming in for Batman to be like, you know what, he deserved it.
Which is interesting that he shows no remorse whatsoever. And I think that as bad as arrow wounds might possibly be fatal, I think the survival rates of being tossed into a vat of chemicals is even less. Even if we're assuming this guy turns out to be the Joker, which canonically he doesn't, by the way. He's totally dead. So there's that.
Whereas nowadays, the Joker has killed how many people? Has killed one of his adopted sons.
Put
Granted, he got
Batgirl in
better,
a
but
wheelchair.
put Batgirl in the wheelchair, and Batman's like, "Oh, I can't kill." Okay, but how many lives could you have saved? But I digress. I'm gonna say something about the purple gloves, though. Okay, color theory. In early comics, so they did not have that many colors for the printing press, so they really tried to keep it simple with their color coding. And this color theory is still active today in movies even, but superheroes were pretty often color coded with primary colors, red, blues, and yellows. That's why Superman has its colors. Purples and greens and oranges were really reserved for villains. So and then blacks often as well were reserved for villains. So it's really interesting that Batman had purple gloves and I think he was always meant to be presented more as an anti-hero. And it was only once comics started getting that push to be more child friendly that they started really pushing to have Batman have his no killing. Oh, okay. Clearly you drive. They started pushing to have Batman have his no killing rule. They pushed to have a reason for Batman to not use guns, because in the early comics he used guns. And yeah, so that's
Kind of like a
just
wild Western hero, maybe like a Wyatt Earp or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Maybe even our good friend known as Clint Eastwood, also known as the Man with No Name. And by the way, we just went into an Inception there for a second. But yeah, he had gun. You know, you think to yourself, man, is this guy trying to be like? I mean, Eastwood wasn't a thing back in the 40s. I just want to point that out. I'm just using this as an example because Batman doesn't have to say much to get his point across, because people, I mean, Superman's a symbol of hope, right? Batman is a symbol of fear. That is his job. It is to inject fear into criminals in Gotham City, specifically in Gotham City. And also, you know, I don't think you see it here in Detective Con. I don't think you see his parents get whacked. Also known as saying his parents get murdered in the middle of an alley with him as he's with his parents when they die. That is messed up psychological trauma. That is psychological trauma, but he uses that to fuel his vendetta against the criminals of Gotham, which is a good thing, because in the beginning, even though he does this here in Detective Comics respectively, yeah, he throws a guy into a vat of acid, he dies. So, but he says, I'm going to make sure that the people of Gotham know that they're, and he says this in a brilliant film. If no one's ever heard of this movie, it's a little indie film called Batman Begins. It's a really well done origin story. Has everyone ever heard of that? Kelly, I don't know if you're familiar with this.
No.
But in the movie, he says, I'm going to make sure that the people of Gotham know that their streets don't belong to the criminals and the corrupt. I'm going to make sure of that. And then Alfred says, how are you going to do it? A symbol. What symbol, sir? And he develops this symbol, and then we get and later on in the comics here, respectively, because I'm going to keep things on the track here, Hollis. I know I'm going off the beaten path here a couple of times. Sue me, but you get the bat signal, you get the Batmobile. What does that do? It injects fear, because fear is one of the most powerful things you can do to a person. One of the things that people have is fear, right? One of our nation's presidents said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So that's Batman. That's literally Batman. So I guess FDR was responsible for creating Batman. I don't know. Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. I don't know. Someone consult me here. But this is an interesting piece of comic book history. And once again, in our good friend's words, you know your history. Very good. Read this book, folks. You're going to learn a lot about Batman because he wore purple gloves. His pointy ears were extremely different back then. His cape was different. The presentation of him as Bruce Wayne was insanely different than what we get 40 years down the line with regards to the comics. I believe it was in the maybe the 80s with the Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns thing. That was kind of a turning point in comic book history. So there you go. Hollis, am I going off the beaten path here? I hope I'm not.
No, it's all good, Ryan. All good. You have good thoughts as always. Yeah, I think what we're all getting at is there's a lot more mystery to Batman in this one. We don't know his backstory, right? We don't even know he's Bruce Wayne until the end. We don't know why he's doing all this crazy stuff, dressing up as a bat and beating criminals with his bare hands at night. We don't know that stuff, and it doesn't quite matter because it's important that I think in this story we don't know who this character is really. And there's all this ambiguity about him, like you were talking about, Kelly, even with the color scheme. What is interesting to me as well is the themes that come out of this comic, specifically with its presentation of criminals and bad guys. Most of the bad guys are stupid. It comes out really clearly that they are bumbling idiots. And even the big bad, his plan is super convoluted and doesn't really make all that much sense, right? So one of the elements seems to also be to make criminals look bad and to make good guys look interesting, right? Because Batman is so much more interesting than any of the bad guys he's fighting. And there seems to be a little bit of a didactic purpose in that trying to steer people away from being like a stupid, superstitious, cowardly criminal and more like cool Batman who fights the criminal.
Crime makes you lose IQ points.
There you go.
Can confirm.
Should that be a PSA? No, I'm just kidding.
Yes.
I love how much we see the story through Commissioner Gordon because I have a bunch of really strong feelings about the importance of Commissioner Gordon to the Batman story. So vigilante stories are us living out a fantasy where we go, what if I could just do something about that, right? Well, okay, even reading a story, you probably aren't like really looking through Batman's eyes very much. But what if part of the fantasy was, okay, well, maybe I can't do it, but someone out there is going to do that. Not only is someone going to do that, but somebody I trust who's supposed to do good in a normal way has access to that person. A lot of other superheroes don't have that like contact point that is like stereotypically trustworthy. And that's not to say that all cops are trustworthy, even in the Batman world. There are corrupt cops pretty early on in Batman even, but somebody is actually doing their job that is a normal real world job, and they have access to this very extreme fantasy of the vigilante who can cut through all the red tape and get it done. And again, this is one of those things that I just didn't know was so early established. I don't think that's necessarily the intention here of telling it through Gordon. I think that was to keep more of the mystery around Batman. But the effect that has had over the decades is that gives us, as we fantasize that we live in a world where people would take up the mantle like this in this specific and honestly insane kind of way, that at least would still have access as the normal people. So it's just, I didn't know that so much could be built out of something that happened a long time ago, which was, well, you're not going to know it's Bruce Wayne yet, so we kind of need to show it to you through mostly Commissioner Gordon.
Yep.
For sure. One of the other interesting things going to wider social issues and themes going on here, unlike the creators of Superman, the creators of Batman, Bill Finger and Bob Kane, were not socialists. And that's kind of obvious in a number of ways. But yet, in this comic, there is a very interesting commentary about wealth going on, in that the bad guy wants money and he doesn't care about people. He's willing to murder people in order to increase his wealth and his power. And that would, on the one hand, feel like a kind of quasi-socialist kind of issue where it's like, ah, yeah, them rich dirtbags, they're the problem with society, you know, this typical Marxist kind of move. And yet that gets turned on its head at the end, where you find out that Batman is actually also a rich guy. But there's this inversion of, whereas the villain, like I said, cares about money, doesn't care about people, Batman has the inversion of that. He doesn't care about wealth, but he does care about people. Hence why he's using his wealth to do this kind of thing. And so it has a very interesting commentary on how it's not the wealth per se that is evil or wrong, but it ultimately goes down to the motivations of the person and what they are after.
In the Batman universe, money is a scalpel. Used correctly, it can save lives. Used incorrectly, it can do so much damage. You know, it's very sharp, very dangerous if you don't use it right.
And once again, that goes back all the way to the first comic. Cool. Final thoughts about this one.
Well, Crayle said we should put that on a t-shirt. Maybe. I don't know. There's so many words that are being shared here on this panel that I feel like these would make great marketing materials for other things that have nothing to do with this subject matter. But hey, things happen. I just have ideas that pop out of nowhere. But hey, that's okay, because creativity is a must.
There you go. Okay. Let's turn then to the final comic for this reading, which comes from the Silver Age, actually, rather than the Golden Age, the very first Spider-Man comic, which is, in my mind anyway, one of the classics of the superhero genre. I'm going to shut up at first and let you guys grab it. What are your thoughts on this very first Spider-Man story?
So, speaking of Stan Lee, this one is so interesting because this goes back to the fantasy of a teenage boy who is nerdy, but then gets superpowers and gets to be super powerful, but it also ties in the trauma of losing a parental figure. And so it has all the makings of what made people love Superman and Batman, because those both came first. And then it just kind of has that youth factor that Superman and Batman didn't have, which is why it really tapped into the cultural zeitgeist at the time when it came out. It just really had something special. It still does. Spider-Man still resonates today. And I was actually impressed by how much has not changed about Spider-Man. And I was surprised by how much made it into Sam Raimi's version of Spider-Man with the first movie. I was like, wow, Sam Raimi was pretty faithful. Not everything, obviously, but a lot of the origin story was pretty faithful with the Sam Raimi movie. And just a lot of Spider-Man's story really taps into those superhero tropes, but in a way that's so down to earth and relatable. And the thing that people always say about Marvel is the Marvel universe is the world outside your window, whereas the DC universe is basically like Greek mythologists telling stories about gods. And I don't always agree, but I can see why Spider-Man really is like Peter Parker is a poor kid from Queens. He's a nerd. He's got the Parker luck, and he definitely. I mean, I feel like he has a lot in common with especially the early versions of Clark Kent, though. I feel like he really is a teenage version of Clark Kent in a lot of ways. And I feel like those two characters really have kind of parallel a lot of parallels that people don't always explore, but I thought it was pretty good. Wordy, but pretty good.
It's Stan Lee. What you gonna do, Kelly?
Moving from the Golden Age stuff to the Silver Age stuff, though, still less was more, even though there was still a lot of words per panel. Like, the whole issue wasn't even Spider-Man. There were 3 other stories in there. I think it was 3. But they packed so much story into just a couple pages. So maybe the trend of like moving to fewer panels per action and things like that has been going on for longer than it's felt like to me even. I guess that's one of the reasons you had us read the stuff in the order you did. Maybe you know what you're talking about, Hollis.
Maybe, or maybe it just worked out that way. It's a fortunate accident.
You know, I was very surprised at this. I got to be honest here. When it comes to Amazing Fantasy with Spider-Man's origin, you get his origin story. You get how he lost his uncle. You get him wanting to kill the guy who murdered his uncle because he wanted revenge. He wanted payback. And what human being doesn't have that thought? Honestly, whether you lost someone to a tragedy, whether someone was mugging them and they got killed during the act, whether it was a car accident, whether your mother passed away due to a health reason in a hospital bed and she was by herself with no one by her side because you were rushing to get to the hospital, but you didn't get there in time and she passed on before you could say goodbye to her. I'm just speaking with examples here, but this packed so much in a very short amount of pages, in a very short amount of time. I got to tell you, I thought, man, Sam Raimi, he pulled a lot from this. And so did the other creators, too. Like, you know, bits and pieces of the reboots, even though Spider-Man's been rebooted way too many times, Hollywood. Stop it. Stop it. Stop rebooting this, okay? People have made this argument that Spider-Man is arguably, if not the most popular character in the history of characters, if not the most popular comic book character in the history of comics, because there's been so many comics featuring this character, right? He's been rebooted countless times, like every other character has been in the comic books. He's been rebooted countless times in the movies. He's been rebooted countless times in the animated series. Look at what they did in the 80s. Spider-Man and his amazing friends. You know, and then you get the hardcore greatness that is 1994's animated Spider-Man show on Fox Kids. Hashtag Fox Kids rules. You know, I was very surprised at this book, and I was very impressed. I mean, granted, I know I'm dealing with people like Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. They're one of the, like, you know, one of the 2 pillars, if not 2 faces that you would see on the Mount Rushmore of comic books. But this packed a lot. More so than the Batman and the Superman did, because Superman just shows up, does his thing, and leaves. Batman does his thing and leaves, and Bruce Wayne's very subdued. Whereas Spider-Man, you get his emotions, you get why he's awkward, why he's shy, you know, why it's hard for him to talk to girls, because he's a nerd, right? People don't think highly of bookworms/nerds. By the way, nerds rule the planet 80 years later, by the way. So thank you, nerds, for that. And geeks. So I was impressed by this. I have a mad amount of respect, more so than I did before, for Stan Lee and Steve Ditko for what they were able to do in such a how many pages was this? Like 10, 12, 15, whatever it was. I am impressed. Very impressed. And there was a lot pulled from this that have been featured in countless movies and animated series, and they have done it. Some of those creators have done it right in other mediums. I'm not talking about the comics. I'm talking about other forms of media here. They've done it very, very well. It's amazing, no pun intended, how they were able to do this. So Spider-Man, I got to tell you, of these 3 stories that you had us read here respectfully, Hollis, Spider-Man's the cream that rises to the top. And by the way, Bonesaw is ready. So it's impressive stuff. if you've never read the first issue featuring Spider-Man, you're going to learn, granted, you're going to recognize a lot of things, right? You're going to recognize a lot of things because you've seen it countless times over. But this is important. This is an important part of comic book literature. This is an important part of comic book history, because Spider-Man, as many people have said, he's the most popular character of all time. Well, now I know why. Because they packed more into this origin story than they ever did in Action Comics #1 and Detective Comics number 23, 27. I don't remember the number. I'm sorry. So I can't remember. But well done, Stan Lee, the late, great Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Well done. In the words of Siskel and Ebert, 2 thumbs way, way up. And what a nice cover, too, with him swinging through the air, carrying that guy. By the way, they've used that in certain forms of media, whether it's the animated series or the movies. Have you noticed that Tom Holland has done it? I'm just saying. Anyway, that's my marvelous take on Spider-Man. Back to you at the desk.
Yeah, I think that the reason this story, they can't ever really get away from it. Whenever they tell the Spider-Man origin, they've never really tried to do something drastically different than this. And there's a reason for that. This story is very powerful. It's got a moral core to it that I think escapes even the Superman and Batman comics from the Golden Age. And it's so much more complex, in my opinion, because Peter is such a more complex character. Being a teenager, he's got all the teenage stuff going on, right? But on top of that, he's bullied. From the very first page, that is the very first thing they establish about him, is that he is a victim of bullying, which again, at the time, would have aligned him very closely with the types of people who would have been reading these comics. And yet, what's also interesting is that he's not necessarily a good person, even though he is very sympathetic, because when he gets his spider powers, this script takes a very drastic turn from Golden Age scripts. In Golden Age scripts, when someone got their superpowers, they tended to just think, logically, what I need to do now is devote my life to fighting crime with these amazing superpowers. But in this story, his very first instinct is gonna make some money with these things. And he even says in one of these panels, where was it? No, I can't find it. But he says something to the extent that the only 2 people in the world he cares about are his aunt and uncle, because they have shown him love and no one else has. So the rest of the world can hang for all he cares. Those are the only 2 people he cares about. That is not the making of a heroic character, right? Peter is...
You know what? This is how most people would react if they got superpowers. Let's be real.
Exactly. And that's what makes it... Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, that's also a more complex return to parts of like the hero's journey. Is like one of the oldest hero's journeys we have in writing ever is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And he starts out as a jerk. Like, that's why he has to go on an epic journey to find like the flower that's going to heal everybody anyways, because he's been a bad, irresponsible leader. He had power and he wasn't doing anything good with it. So that's a relief. That's a return for me that I find to be relieving, you know, like, okay, like, let's let the complexities of how people are be in the media. Like, it's the same thing with the whole, like, never ever kill to be a hero. Okay, well, I want to live in a fantasy, but I don't want to live in that much of a fantasy, right?
No pun intended.
There you go.
It's just nice to see people take a while to become a hero. That's more aspirational to me, to think, okay, well, I can start over and I can be better than I was. And if you're going to be aimed at kids, I think it's actually more important, not less. Sometimes there's temptation in children's media to never show anybody that the kids can identify with doing anything seriously bad. I'm not saying that media always gives in, but that's like a gut reaction sometimes. Whereas I think for kids, it's most important to see, okay, you can start behaving badly and selfishly, because I mean, kids are more selfish than adults usually, right? Because they're more self-centered by nature. They haven't gotten the information they need to develop the empathy and look outward. So that's really relatable to me. He starts out being like, I want to get rich and famous, and I'm not worried about this gift is for me, not you. And then evolving.
Yeah, because they perfectly display that in the first iteration of Spider-Man when it comes to the Spider-Man cinematic universe, because it's a cinematic universe now. I don't know why. Everything has to be connected. Why? Anyway, in the first Spider-Man movie, he gets his powers and he's enjoying them, right? But then he figures, hey, how am I going to impress MJ? Well, I got to make some money. Well, how do you make money? By becoming a professional wrestler, brother. Yeah. And you get that money to buy a car because she's impressed in the movie by Flash Thompson's car. So Peter thinks to himself, well, if I get a car, I'm going to impress Mary Jane to the point where I'm going to have her on my shoulder. I'm going to have the car. I'm going to have the girl. I'm going to have the notoriety. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to be famous. You're going to be the most popular guy in school, just like my old friend Zach Morris was at Bayside High way back when in the 90s. Isn't that right, folks? If you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google it later. But it's amazing. No pun intended, Peter. It's amazing what, and by the way, if I were in high school, I would have pulled the same thing. I would have tried to make as much money on this as I could. I would try to impress as many non-existent friends that I really didn't have much in high school that I had. And I would say, hey guys, look what I got. I got the latest skateboard. I got the latest car. What do you got? Nothing. You know, that's the thing about heroes. They're not perfect. They start off as complete, some heroes do start off as jerks. And then they learn a few things. They learn the ways of the Force, young Padawan. And then they become the Jedi. # this is not the right franchise for this conversation. But it's still relevant, okay? It's still kind of relevant. So what I'm saying is, if you get superpowers, just in the words of the Grail Knight from the Indiana Jones movies and The Last Crusade, which is the best of the sequels, by the way, you must choose. Choose wisely. So there's my advice to you who may be watching or listening to this brilliant discussion led by Hollis and his fellow panelists.
Thank you, Ryan. And those were great thoughts. Yeah, I think that's part of why the comic has such a gut punch when Uncle Ben dies. And then even more at it's classic, this is almost Greek tragedy level reversal, when he realizes that through his selfishness, he was part of the reason for one of the only people he cared about dying. And that packs such a punch because he realizes too late, tragically, that he was wrong to be selfish, that you can't actually just care about the people who care about you and think everything's going to be okay. Everyone is connected, and there are consequences for every action that we take. And hence the famous line, with great power comes great responsibility at the end. And part of why it's so tragic too is that this is the end of the comic, right? Is Spider-Man just very sad Peter walking off into the night with the finality of the loss of his uncle. And that's where we leave this comic. Unlike Batman and Superman, where Batman doesn't even give us a backstory. And Superman, yeah, his planet died, but, he doesn't remember any of that stuff. Being an infant, we assume. And so there's so much more palpable trauma in the Spider-Man story. And I also think, to skip ahead to talk more about the future of Spider-Man, one of the things I think is so compelling about Spider-Man and his rogues gallery later on is that all of his rogues gallery tend to be people who got superpowers accidentally and were outcasts socially who then use their superpowers for selfish reasons. And I think there's this beautiful element to the Spider-Man story in that Peter is able to be the person who fights those people because he used to be them. That he understands what it's like to be in the position that they were in. And he's gone through not turning to a life of crime, but a life of selfishness like they were. And therefore, he understands them to a level that nobody else does.
I think that's also part of the reason that for the most part, he stays your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, because that can happen to anybody. If it happened to him, then it can keep happening to other people in his neighborhood too. Whereas more godlike or billionaire-like examples, Superman, Batman, you know, they're exceptional. They have to, they start out in just Metropolis and Gotham, but they end up really fast, like as further and further iterations go, like being in charge of these like planetary crises. Whereas even in the current Marvel cinematic universe with the Avengers and everything, Peter Parker is constantly just like, why am I included in this? I'm just your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, right? Because his comfort zone is dealing with his neighbors who've also been through trauma and accidentally gotten turned into a superpowered weirdo. Like,
these comics are definitely should be used by OSHA to support workplace safety.
Have you guys seen the how it should have ended videos for the Spider-Man movies, where they always have like one of the scientists and he's like, hey, I got a bright idea. Why don't you make sure that that's safe before you wind up radiating somebody?
No, but I need to watch those.
Oh, fun stuff. Any final comments about Spider-Man? Cool.
Like I said, there's a reason this character has lasted for so long. All three of these characters, there's a reason that they have lasted so long in public consciousness. They really, each of them has different things that resonate, some similarities, but these are kind of our mythology. And it's interesting to see how each generation somewhat reinvents them to fit that generation, to fit that decade era. But a lot of the bones of the character remain, like Crayle was saying about Lois Lane, is still the same. Superman has changed to some extent, but still a lot of what makes Superman is still the same. A lot of what makes Batman still remains. The heart of Spider-Man is still the same. And it's interesting that what resonates about these heroes stays the same, even as we reinvent them to fit with whatever our current reality is. They're still relevant. And that's pretty cool from a storytelling standpoint, to have that these creators created these stories and these characters that are just so long lasting and just mean so much to us culturally.
There's a reason why we have these posters up on our walls, guys, okay? Whether it's the Super Loop, greatest of all time, by the way. Whether it's the Dark Knight of Gotham City, also known as the Cape Crusader, also known as I'm Batman, and Spider-Man. There are reasons that people cosplay as these characters at your local conventions, which, by the way, if you've never been to a convention, go to one, take your friends, take your family, take that little text, why don't you? Because Comic-Cons are the best thing since sliced bread. Hashtag those are the facts, and they are undisputed. So there's a reason these characters are still being talked about. If it weren't for Action Comics #1 in 1938, none of us would be sitting here. None of us would be talking about these heroes like we do today. So Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster, Bill Finger, Bob Kane, Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, among many other writers, many other artists who have put these characters together in a comic book. Whether it's been on television, it's been on film, or it's been in a comic book, most importantly, the comic books came first. Just remember, the comic books came first, not the movies, okay? I know some people like to say, well, I remember watching this movie going, yes, that's fine, but just remember, everything comes from something, okay? The movies come from the books. The movies are, you know what I mean? Like, books come before anything else. So just all you got to do is take the advice for a good friend, LeVar Burton. Take a look. It's in a book. That's all you got to do. There's a reason why these characters have lasted so long as they have. And I wish the creative teams of these characters the best of luck with them moving forward, because we know we're going to get more comics featuring these characters down the line, right? We know we're going to get more animated series on streaming services down the line. We're going to get more live action movies presenting these characters in different ways, in different forms. People of different ethnicities and cultures are going to be playing these characters for years and years and years to come. Hey, have at it, because, oh, what tangle webs we weave. It's a big world out there, ladies and gentlemen. Go out there, tell the story you want to tell, let them tell their stories. If it's fan fiction, who cares? If it gets published in a book, an anthology, great. If it doesn't, at least you wrote it. Publish it somehow, some way. I don't care how you do it, because everyone has a voice. And if you want to put something down on paper, put something down on your itty bitty little thing known as the computer, go ahead and do it, because as a wise person once said, the sky's the limit.
Yeah, if I had any parting thoughts about this exercise where we read Understanding Comics and then 3 examples of 3 first appearances of superheroes, it's that superheroes have something to offer you, and comic books as a visual storytelling media have something to offer you. And if the stuff that you're coming up with in this class, even if these aren't the exact characters for you, or this isn't the exact, like, you know, Hollis doesn't happen to cover the exact franchises that are going to be your favorites, there's so much out there. Start wikiing or Googling. Like, if you're super into post-apocalyptic stuff, like, Google good post-apocalyptic comics or something like that. And the stuff that you're learning in this course is going to give you a newer, deeper look once you find the exact genre that you want for comic books. I'm not trying to tell you what to do outside of class, but I am going to tell you it's my personal opinion that you're going to miss out if you don't try to find at least a couple of different comic books that are in your wheelhouse and your genres that you really like, because the medium has so much to offer, and that's why it is so enduring. That's why it keeps growing and changing the way that it does.
Could not have said it better myself, Crayle. Well, that is all the time we have for this lecture. You can come back. You will all have to come back next time if you want a good grade, and go to the next video lecture, which unfortunately will not have these 3 awesome people in it. But thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts. This is, I'm sure you students know, much more interesting than just me talking at the camera.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.